You are about to explore the intersection of ancient astronomy and prehistoric engineering at Germany's Mega-Mound, Magdalenenberg. Joining us is Dr. Allard Mees, an archaeologist and head of the Scientific ID department at the Leibniz Institute of Archaeology in Mainz, Germany. Allard takes us on an extraordinary journey through, around and above this massive ancient superstructure, unveiling its role as a sophisticated tool for charting the movements of the sun, moon and stars. He reveals how it marked the changing seasons, shaped cultural practices, and orchestrated ritual activities, offering profound insights into the ingenuity of its creators.
The Magdalenenberg is a huge tumulus, a big burial mound where you can find roughly 120 tombs inserted in a circular way in the tomb, and in the middle of the huge tumulus, as they call it, there is a princely grave. So the chief or king or boss, or it's quite unclear how these important people were actually called in the Celtic times. He was buried in the middle, and together with him, there was a wagon given to him, and also some further things, also animal parts and so on.
Okay.
But for our story here, it is relevant that, so to say, his people were buried around him. And this was a prince or a chief who was part of the so-called Hallstatt culture, which is basically the early phase of the Celtic period. It's around 620, 610 BC. And this Hallstatt culture was distributed over Europe, from Burgundy in France to southern France, up to through Austria and up to Slovenia even. Yeah. So, and that is not just a speculation, but they have done a lot of general chronological research, also from the wooden elements which has been found, among others, also in the Magdalenenberg tumulus, and this also points to this period or this date. So you have this type of tumulus, burial mound. You have it spread it over nearly 1,500 kilometers from Burgundy up to Slovenia. So it was really a systematic phenomenon and not a single individual, let's say, invention on the spot. So apparently it has been part of their culture understanding.
Is there an architectural legacy leading up to this site?
That's a good question. Actually, I don't know. We haven't found. As more it happens more with these kind of cultures, they rather appear out of the blue.
Okay.
In southern Germany, in Burgundy, we actually do not really know where they came from.
Really?
Yeah. So they are working now on strontium analysis, so where you can analyze where people which have been buried there may have originally lived. But there is no clear indication as to whether they came, let's say, from Asia or from, let's say, the steppes.
Yes. In Neolithic Scotland, you see the arrival of the Neolithic farmers about between 5 and 4,000 BC, who were burying themselves in very simple stone kists. And then over the preceding 1,000 years, you see monumentality like Maze How in the Ring of Brodkar, but that came much later, and you do see an architectural progression. But you have reason to believe then that this just happened, it just occurred.
Yeah, and well, already, looking at the conclusions as to where it comes from, there is no clear development before this Hallstatt culture in this kind of type of burial mounds. And there are also no burial mounds like this in, let's say, in the Italian area, so just south of the Alps. So it's quite an independent feature, but I think that is actually an explanation that they took the whole idea out of the Mediterranean area. So they sort of imported this concept of how to build their burial mounds with this astronomical orientation. But the concept of this is the astronomical world and systems. They must have at least partly imported that from the Mediterranean, and that could explain why it just pops up north of the Alps without any forerunners, so to say.
Have you done any comparative measures against Etruscan archaeoastronomy?
Yeah, sure. No, but so from the burial mounds we know from Italy, from the center of Italy, for instance, there's nothing, let's say, significant concerning orientations, or it's nothing we can discern from the plans which have been published. But there's not much research on that. One must add to that.
Now you've described what the site is and when it was built. Could you discuss the building orientations and the astronomical alignments pertaining especially to the lunar maximums and minimas within the tomb?
Well, what I actually did, I took the excavation plan as they have been published in the 1970s, and the site was excavated in the 1970s, and they showed these 120 burials in a circular way, and huge palisades, post-hole rows, for which the excavators at that time didn't have any serious explanation.
Were the post holes around the tomb, Allard?
The post holes and, let's say, the palisades, they are in a linear way, starting from the center, exactly the middle of the burial mound, where also the princely grave is. And there are two large palisades going towards the northwest and two large palisades to the southeast, but they are not parallel, but they are a bit, let's say, moving away from each other when going outwards from the center of the burial mound. It's a very, very strange ordering of such wooden rows. And that's why the excavator, when it was published in 6 big volumes, the maximum explanation was something that could have been used for construction reasons or so. But why would you need construction palisades for burial mound? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. So, and later on, in Slovenia, these very similar post holes and palisades have been found, and then they only have written, well, there is no normal explanation for this, but this might have been for cult purposes or maybe religious. So very, very vague, but they had already the idea that this is not a phenomenon which can be explained by, let's say, statical reasons or whatever. So, yeah, so these orientations of the palisades are very curious and unique. And they only occur also in these other burial mounds in Slovenia. But the orientations of the heads of the tombs, which are arranged in this circular way, are all the heads of the buried people are focusing towards these palisades. In the case of Magdalenenberg, towards the southeast.
Okay,
and this is a very strong indication that so the burying of these people was in relation with these huge post hole rows or big posts which have been planted there.
So it was really the Palisades that gave you your first suspicions, if you like, that there was much more going on here than a static tomb, if you like. You knew that there was a significant ritual function as well as a monumental function.
Yeah. And what also was very clear that these posts which have been used there were not just very small, tiny matches, so to say, but they were really thick, massive posts.
How thick were they? How wide? What kind of radius?
Yeah. No, we talk about 30 centimeter. So really big posts, nearly trees.
Okay, so really significant, built to last.
And from what you could see, and that was a lucky situation in Magdalenenberg, there was a very humid soil, so all these wooden parts have been preserved. So you could still see them standing, and you could also see from there that these, let's say, post hole trees, nearly trees, they must have been visible also above the surface of the burial mound. So you could see at that time, you talk about 616 BC, they were clearly visible above the surface of the burial mound. So it was, for everyone walking around there, very much visible that these Palisades had, some function, and that, of course, explains why I think this orientation of the burials, which are circular, but all literally heading to these Palisades, that they knew where they were because all these people were not buried at the same moment. So there's sort of probably some 40 years it was in use as a burial mound, and so there must have been an orientation for the later buried people in which direction their heads should be put. Yeah.
You're talking about the heads being oriented to the southeast. Can you talk about that orientation? So what are the Palisades aligned to?
Yeah. So you have Palisades towards the northwest and towards the southeast, diverging on each half of the tumulus, which bisects the tumulus, in fact, in two halves. Yeah? But this is a very, I would say, curious construction. And basically, I was then searching indeed for, could it have some astronomical, archaeoastronomical meaning? And then, more or less, one passes along the pattern of the lunar standstills. And if you go into Wikipedia, whatever, and you type in lunar standstills, the sort of first image you encounter is exactly this kind of orientation of like it has been done in these Palisades. Basically, towards southeast or northwest, these diverging Palisades, these are the extremes of the moon, which the moon is wavering around the solar routes, so to say, along the sky, but also then, of course, at the horizon.
So, Allard, in simple terms, are you saying the Palisades form a lunar X?
Yeah, it's a very flat X.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
You're on the 30-degree latitude, so are you looking at about 9 or 12 degrees at the lunar minimum?
Yeah, so most people who are interested in, let's say, archaeoastronomical things, they are aware about the solar risings and falls during the solstices.
Mm-hmm.
So you have them actually on 4 positions. So the Nebra disk is very clearly and precise describing. So there's one point in the northeast, then southeast and northwest southwest.
Yeah.
So these are 4 points at the horizon. And each time 5 degrees above and below each of these solar points, solar extremes, so the solstices, these are the places where the moon has its, let's say, its maximum or its minimum rising or descending points. So the point is that the sun is moving half a year from, let's say, the northern extreme towards the south, and then the next half year it is, let's say, moving back from the south to the north. The moon is doing the same thing, but within 1 month. But the extremes of this monthly movement is changing. And so the maximum is 5 degrees further to the north of this solar maximum, and in the south is 5 degrees further south. So
is that rule for every latitude?
Yeah, there are some degrees of difference in there. But since this Hallstatt culture was, let's say, basically geographically more or less in a horizontal way from Burgundy to southern Germany, Austria, and then Slovenia, it doesn't have any influence on that.
The visual observation is the same.
Yeah, right. And that's, of course, an important aspect, that it's a repeating phenomenon in these tumuli from Burgundy to southern Germany and Slovenia. So this is not an individual, so one time occurring phenomenon. And that is, to me, a very clear indication that these orientations, sometimes they are heading the heads and these palisades or what have been left from there, so post holes, traces, and so they are possibly to the northeast, northeastern lunar standstills, as these extremes of the moon are called, or for instance also to the southeast or northeast. So that was apparently not really crucial, but basic important is that the heads are orientated towards one of the lunar standstills. So there was not a certain preference for only, let's say, the southeastern lunar standstill. So the maximum lunar standstill. You have the minor, lunar standstill, which is 5 degrees within the solar extreme, and have the maximum or great lunar standstill 5 degrees even further south. So, and this movement of the moon, it's a very rapid movement in terms of celestial phenomenon. So it's a monthly movement, is something which you might describe as a breathing, a sort of cosmic breathing, as it is sometimes described. So the risings and settings of the moon are never on the same position at the horizon. With the sun, it's a much slower movement.
Yeah.
But in the summer or midsummer or mid-winter maxima, so the solstice, as everyone knows, for instance, Stonehenge, that solstice is in practice the point where the moon rises at nearly 2 weeks at the same place. But so it's very easy to fix that point. With the lunar risings and settings, it's much more difficult because it jumps along the horizon.
So while the sun has a 3-day solstice every year, twice a year, you're saying the moon has its 2 solstices every 18.6 years, at which time that standstill lasts for 2 weeks.
The lunar standstill doesn't last like that. It's still as dynamic as it is always. Mm-hmm. The solar solstice is such a very stable point at the horizon during 10 or 14 days. But that's why it is so difficult to catch the point at the horizon for the moon, because it's really jumping around. So because the jumps between every day are several degrees.
Yes, that causes me great confusion. I sometimes try to plot temples here in Colombia, and you'll have worked out what the minor standstill day is, and then you go to Google Earth and you go forward and back by 1 day, and you think, no, there's something fundamentally wrong with this program because it's jumping around there by several degrees.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. So it's a much more... Not only is it a more difficult cycle to record because it's over 18.6 years, but it's a much more difficult event to pin down when it actually happens.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you mentioned. So although it is at the horizon difficult to grasp, because the moon settings and risings are so dynamic, let's say, in terms of jumping every day further and back and back. If you look at towards the heavens, let's say, not at the horizon, but vertically above, then it is much easier to see it. And so we can more or less say how stable, let's say, the route of the sun is. Well, that's quite easy to see. And also when you look above, the moon wavers, oscillates around this solar path in 5 degrees. Let's say further higher or lower as the solar path. So looking upwards, there it is fairly easy to measure, even with your fingers, with your hand, how far the moon is, let's say, north or south of the solar path.
So what you're saying is then, rather than them taking measurements of the moon rising on the horizon, they were monitoring it crossing a meridian.
Yeah.
So they were taking vertical measures of angle in a clear sky rather than a horizon which might have rising heat and bend their measure by 3 degrees.
Yeah. But from there on, so you can easily, I would say within one night, you can figure out what the furthest distance of the moon towards the solar path is, these 5 degrees. And if you have that, let's say, with your hand or with a wooden plank, you can measure that just visually. And it is really trivial to focus the point of the midsummer solstice or the midwinter solstice of the sun. You just have to, let's say, prolong to the left or to the right these measures which you did with your hand or with this wooden plank when you look at the horizon, and then you have these points to the right and the left of the great lunar standstill or the minor lunar standstill. So it's a 2 steps procedure, but pretty easy to find out. The question is, of course, how did they find out? Yeah, 18.6 years. Then you have the next maximum lunar standstill. So there is a sort of a cycle there, and this takes, of course, time. Yeah, so establishing counting the months in between and so on. And we know from the ancient sources that the people north of the Alps were familiar with the so-called Saros cycle, which is 19 years. And this is roughly 1 month less. So one would take this 18.6 years cycle of the lunar standstills, and if you add 1 month cycle to that, then you have 19 years exactly. This 19 years is important. That is when the moon and the sun are really exactly on the same point again. So this fixes these cycles. Well, so the 18.6 is not entirely that's a calendaric.
It's solely restricted to the cycle of the moon. Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing is it can happen in the very precise lunar standstill can happen after 18.5 years in the spring or in autumn. Well, but the Saros, so 19 years is really that it absolutely fits.
Yes.
And apparently both cycles were known towards the Hallstatt people.
But of course, if you're trying to express that with a stone or in stone, it's much easier to lay out 19 of something or remember 19 of something than 18.6.
I think if you look at lunar standstill years, so next year, 2024, we will have another lunar standstill year.
Mm-hmm.
And then the eclipses of the moon are always in this month, the spring month, in every lunar standstill year. So we will have also lunar eclipses again in the spring month. So if that was of course one of the first things which was noticed by these ancient people, that there is every nearly 19 years there is there is one 19 years, but they have one when there is the minor lunar standstill in the spring month, and there's one in the spring month of the great lunar standstill year.
So what you're saying is perhaps in ancient cultures, I know that's a broad term, but it stands up here.
Mm.
The 18.6 year lunar cycle perhaps had huge symbolic or ritual significance, whereby astronomers actually working on lunisolar calendars were more interested in the 19-year cycle where the sun and the moon culminate.
Exactly.
Okay,
and
that's clear.
And it seems that actually nearly all, let's call them between brackets, primitive cultures, they are always based on lunar cycles.
Mm-hmm.
That there are actually two types of calendars. One is, let's say, the farmer's calendar, one calls it like that, which then further develops into, let's say, an astronomical calendar with really counting of days until when the sun and the moon are on the same position again. So this is entirely functional for calendaric purposes. And the second kind of calendar were cultural or religious calendars, how you may call them. So we have no precise, let's say, categorization of from when onwards something is a cultural calendar. But to me, it seems clear that this 18.6 cycle of the lunar standstills is not precisely a calendaric calendar cycle, but it must have had a cultural meaning, and that's why it occurs in this in these tombs, in this funeral culture.
Yes,
because it is. At the beginning of my research, I was thinking that maybe this this chief of this tribe of Hallstatt people in the Black Forest, Villingen-Schwenningen, the chief may have died exactly in the year of the lunar standstill, and that's why they built these huge palisades to indicate the lunar standstill directions. But when I later on found more and more of these orientations in the other in the other burial mounds, up to 1,000 kilometers away towards Slovenia, so not all the chiefs were dying in the year of the lunar standstill. Yeah.
How do you know?
No. So
I get it.
Yeah, so that's why I concluded that this must have to do something with the lunar standstills, and then you come quite quickly when you then look further to what actually the cultural meaning of the lunar standstills was in antiquity.
Yes. I want you to hold on, because towards the end, I'm going to start getting into the questions pertaining to what it might have meant.
Yeah.
I have a very specific question relating to what you've just said. Understanding that these are built to either monumentalize or serve as calendrical tools for monitoring the moon, how on earth did you specify the date 618 BC? Why that particular date or year?
Right, because they have analyzed all these wooden parts of the found in the burial chamber and the palisades of Magdalenenberg, and there were a few earlier dates of that, but virtually, let's say 95% of the wooden pieces they analyzed all pointed to 616 BC, 614 BC. Yeah. So this is very much focused towards a single year, and that's where apparently when the whole construction was constructed, that they cut a lot of trees and so nearly done in all 1 or 2 years.
Okay.
But that was simply a dead end where I was at the beginning of my research, when I still thought that they were why then lunar orientated on the lunar standstill. I at the beginning I thought it might have to do with the year of the passing of the chief, but it isn't logic. Even also because one needs much more time to prepare such a burial mound. Yeah, you cannot say, okay, the chief has died, and now within 2 weeks or 1 month, maybe we're going to build this burial mound. So, like in the Egyptian pyramids or whatever, these things have already started normally when the chief was still living.
So perhaps in their teenage years, when a new ruler takes position, he begins to maybe develop or expand on something his father had left or built behind him. That's fantastic. Yeah. So wonderful insight.
Of course, so the burial mound that must have taken, I was at least a year to build. Yeah, and this. From the analyses which have been done, it was quite clearly built in winter time. Okay, when people were not working on the fields or whatever. So Magdalenenberg is quite informative concerning these things. Right? There are the other tumuli in France or where there is much less documentation being done, but we have the plans of the tumuli. And
you published that it served a calendrical function almost as a seasonal pointer. Do you think then that people visited those sites, maybe with staffs or in groups, and used them to make determinations regarding passing time? Or do you think they were purely monumental structures that enshrined the key moments in the moon cycle?
I think the last thing. There's a very practical reason for that. That is, although these palisades were huge and massive, even these were rotten away 20 or 30 years later. So you most likely wouldn't have seen them after 30 years anymore. Yeah, so then it disappeared. So then you only have a huge burial, a smaller hill in the landscape. And that's, of course, the question. Was it still being recognized by later people? Well, the Hallstatt people at some time disappeared or went further into the Celtic, real Celts, what we understand as the classic Celts, or Eisenzeitlich, you call them. No, I think this was an expression for the chief, for the king, himself, and the meaning of these lunar standstills was attached to this chief and his people.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why how I started looking into the cultural meaning of these lunar standstills.
Before we come to the cultural meaning, I recently interviewed Klaus Clausen, who's a researcher in Denmark who has done very similar research into several hundred significant lunar mounds where sightlines existed, and then the mounds were built on top of the sightlines because the sightlines were marked with stone beneath the mounds. Have you done any similar scans or research at the Magdalenenberg site to see if they were built upon significant sites that perhaps identified lunar astronomy prior to the Bronze Age?
No, it's quite clearly no. It has to do with the phenomenon that these Hallstatt people really came from nowhere, or we don't know. There are no predecessing settlements there, or there is some little bit Bronze Age around, but there's nothing. It's not continuing anything.
Yes, yes, okay.
So it's really, it pops up out of nothing. Yeah, this whole concept. Yeah.
As a step towards the significance to the builders, I'd like to tell you about an interview I conducted recently with Professor Helen Benini.
Yep.
She, with Barbara Carter, wrote a book interpreting the Coligny lunisolar calendar. And in that interview, they said, essentially, this bronze Celtic calendar that was found and talked about by Julius Caesar is built on 5 12-month cycles plus 2 intercalendary. So we have a numerical total there of 62. That is the number that defines the cycle of the moon. When we spoke last time, you told me about 62 post holes at the Hookdorf site. Could you put that number 62 into context and tell me if you think this is pure numerology or a monumentalization of the number 62?
Hoogdorf was also a burial mound. And in the Hoogdorf burial mound, also a chief has been found, but all in position. So with his golden shoes and his bronze bed, and so everything still intact. And there, the burial chamber, the corners of the burial chamber are also orientated towards the lunar standstills. So why wonder, I would say, since it is all the same culture as the Magdalenenberg and the others. But around there, you have 64 posts.
Okay.
But that's interesting. 64. It's not because of the number itself, but they are done in a very regular way. And I and my colleague in Paris were wondering how you get in a circle 64 post holes in a regular way with regular distances planted. And for that, you need maths.
Yeah, there isn't a whole number integer, is there? So they must have done it in 4 quarters. What would that be? What's 64 divided by 4?
Yeah. But how to do? Okay, you can divide it in your head, but you have to put it on a circle around this tumulus, and that makes it, of course, very complicated to do it by mind. So you have to have knowledge of mathematical or geometrical principles.
Yes.
And so this is, to me, one of the nice examples as a demonstration that these people of the Hallstatt culture living about 600 or 500 BC north of the Alps, that they were intellectually capable of doing these things.
But I really struggle with that, Allard. You said it's easy to work out. Well, it's easy to go 64 divided by 4. But if you take a 360-degree circle,
Yeah.
That's a stone every 5.62 degrees. So I'm struggling with that. How on earth did they begin with expressing 0.62 with a stone?
Yeah, and then you come into the Pythagorean maths, and that's how they could have, and I think possibly have done it. And this is also interesting phenomenon that Julius Caesar, who describes, of course, later than the 600 BC.
Tell us what Caesar actually described. It was the Celtic calendar, I believe.
Caesar describes first he describes that astronomy was a major thing within the Celts, and that they had cycles, and one of these cycles, cosmic cycle, was this 30-year cycle, which is also documented in this Coligny calendar, which you mentioned before. So 6 times 5, and then you are at what they call a great year in the Celtic times.
Yes.
So cycles. So Caesar is describing this, and that this is all moon-based with the Celts at that time. And Caesar is not just a source, one of the sources, because Caesar himself was the head of the Roman calendar.
Yes, the keeper of the calendar.
And he was the Pontifex Maximus, so the upper priest and head of the Roman calendar. And the Julian calendar, which is still in use by the Orthodox Church nowadays, is called Julian because based on the calendar of Julius Caesar. So it is not a trivial source, which describes that the Celts were so deeply involved in discussing and working with these moon cycles as a base of their culture. And besides that, he mentions that the Celts were not using written documents to deal with these things. So it was all illiterate, not in terms that they couldn't write. That's what he clearly says, because we have from the 1st century BC, we have some Celtic documents written in Celtic, but he says these things had to be memorized by the Celts, and especially there are specialists for it. And this is what the phenomenon, what you can see in the Coligny calendar, that the Coligny calendar has intercalary months, Celtic months, but they are inserted in a very regular way. And this has the advantage that you can memorize the order of these intercalary months. So that's why there are these bronze plaques. They are from the 2nd century AD, after Christ, but they must have been established at least 400 or 500 years to work out these kind of calendars. And since there is no further literal evidence of the Celts dealing with this, it does seem to fit with Caesar's observation that this was memorized, especially then the intercalary months, to get the cycles fitting to the solar cycles. Because that's the aim of all ancient things, to get the both cycles of the moon and the sun together at one point. So that is this calendaric function.
Yeah.
And in between you have this cultural meaning of certain cycles which are sitting in between.
A thought comes to mind, Allard. Assuming the Coligny calendar depicts a tablet or an ancient spreadsheet of the cycles of the moon, and so too does the Antikythera device show or predict the cycles of the moon. Have the functions of the Coligny calendar be compared to the mechanics of the Antikythera device?
The Coligny calendar bronze plates, they are big.
How big? What are we looking at?
We were talking about a couple of square meters.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, my word.
Yeah. So these are really big places. So they were not transportable, and they were found near or at a temple, sacred area in the center of Gaul. So this was a massive one, and these big plates, this only depicts one cycle of 5 years, and we know that there are 6 times 5 cycles. So maybe there have been 5 other such huge bronze plates, but we have only found of the knowledge of one. There's even a second one, which was found a bit further away. But this was clearly a kind of documentation, as you say, a spreadsheet of keeping track of the lunar cycles, which was done on the spot and not transportable. The Antikythera mechanism has the interesting aspect that it was a sort of Black Forest cuckoo's clock.
A Black Forest cuckoo clock.
Yeah. But much more advanced in its cycles and in its mechanics anyhow.
Okay.
So the Antikythera displayed all the planetary cycles, the solar cycles and the lunar cycles. And it had also, that's the most recent development in the Antikythera research, is also the notice of the lunar standstills and the lunar nodes, which are going with these lunar standstills analyses. So, and the big advantage of the Antikythera mechanism is that it was really something portable, and you could carry it around. It was found on a ship, by the way, near that island of Antikythera.
You can't call it a cuckoo clock, Doctor.
Yeah. So it was already en route to someone else. We don't know where it was going, possibly to Rome. And so when you put this Antikythera on the table of a Roman senator or even a barbarian chief, you can then explain in a couple of hours how the Mediterranean calendars are actually working. That is the brilliant thing of the Antikythera. I always say the Antikythera mechanism is sort of Rembrandt of antiquity.
Yeah, thank you. That's a far better parallel to draw than the former.
And the other thing is that with the Antikythera mechanism, that if you look at the wheels themselves and the thieves on sitting on it, they are done in a way that it cannot have been used for permanent usage. So it wasn't running 24 hours, 365 days a year, because the usage of these chains on the wheels would have been enormously, and at that time they had only peaked tooths on the wheels. So it was really used for, let's say, short presentations, as one would possibly describe it as. So really something of to use it in teaching people about these cycles. Yeah. And that was, of course, entirely different with the Coligny calendar, which was really in a sacred place.
So this is fascinating. What you've described, wittingly or unwittingly, is the development of similar observations into proto-sciences, where in the Gallic Celtic world, this information was perhaps kept at a static lunar temple or a sacred lunar site that was known for its conglomeration of such things, whereas the Antikythera device was a mobile teaching piece which describes much more than the cycles of the moon, perhaps the sun and planets as well, yeah?
Exactly. And it also is very typical, one would even say, that the Celtic Coligny calendar was not movable, was sitting in one place.
It was in the head, it resided in the minds of the astronomers, whereas, as you say, the cuckoo clock did all the work for the Antikythera device.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that the Coligny calendar is, like you say, it's a kind of spreadsheet where you put a peg in each day where you are currently are. But it doesn't tell you really when do you have to insert an intercalary month. So this is still additional knowledge, which is compulsory to have this functioning.
So that one piece of occult knowledge, meaning hidden wisdom, perhaps only ever spoken orally, never written down, is the hidden lever by which the whole thing spins and functions. Yeah.
There was apparently a group of, nowadays called specialists, who had this knowledge, who had memorized this apparently when the intercalary calendars, months, should be inserted. Whereas, due to the extremely complex and advanced and very clever construction of the Antikythera, it was all visible in movement. So there is no hidden knowledge in the Antikythera mechanism.
Yes.
You can explain everything because the wheels are themselves already the rhythm of the mechanism. The size of the wheels determines how long the let's say this Venus is circulating, or Jupiter, or whatever. So this is all mechanically explainable. Even the irregularity of the lunar path is represented in the irregular elliptic form of the wheels of the Antikythera mechanism.
Yes.
So it's all, let's say, brought to the outside world and not esoteric anymore.
You're saying the Antikythera device is explicit, whereas the Coligny calendar is obscure.
Yeah, the knowledge to keep or to have the Coligny calendar working is not sitting in this object. It's in the heads of the memorized in the heads of these specialized people who knew how to deal with it.
Okay. Now, Allard, this takes us to the hardest question for a scientist to answer, because I have to probe into what you think the significance of the moon was in the cosmologies of the Hallstatt culture.
There's a phenomenon which we have found there. So there's the construction of the Palisades and the directions of these Palisades. So this all points to the lunar standstills. And with the lunar standstills, there are the so-called lunar nodes. So that's what the points in between when the moon is changing its, let's say, its direction, from going from its maximum now to the so it's ascending and descending moon. So it's all a concept which even nowadays in astrology still a thing, but the difference is that nowadays there is sort of idea that the stars or the moon, whatever, would have a direct influence on our lives or whatever, or our future. But in antiquity, there were the gods who were doing this. Yeah? So it's not really the physical moon or Jupiter or whatever. These are the spiritual powers behind the moon or before the moon, if you want. So, and in antiquity, and then I come again to the dualism of these calendars. So you have the technical time calendars and you have the cultural or religious calendars. If we look at the big astronomer Ptolemaeus, whose books about the position of the stars and whatever were still in use even by Columbus in 1400 something. Yeah? So throughout the whole medieval time and in antiquity, Ptolemaeus was a sort of astronomical Bible for the positioning of stars and so on. But Ptolemy has also written a book about the astrological meaning of all these phenomena. This, in a modern understanding of astronomy, the second part, what Ptolemy did, is entirely abandoned. Yeah, it's not considered as relevant anymore. Okay, yeah, fine. But for an ancient people, this was at least as much as important as the simple calculation: where does the sun or the moon will rise and set? Yeah,
absolutely, Allard. In a great sense, the second book was the purpose for the first.
Yeah. But we know this goes up to the Renaissance. Newton was still, apart from his important work, where we now even profit nowadays from, he was still trying to find out the measures of the Arch of Noah.
He was looking for the date for the apocalypse in the measurements of the Solomon's Temple, which might not have existed.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, but Ptolemy has exactly the same thing. So he was looking into the phenomenon of lunar standstills and the lunar nodes.
Yes.
He associates the lunar nodes with the situation around the birth and of anyone. So how the stars are standing at a certain lunar node moment has influence on everyone who is being born.
Yes.
And this is a very crucial statement of Ptolemy. So it's nothing invented by me. It's just written by Ptolemy, because Caesar, and we come back to the head of the Roman calendar, he writes about the Celts that they were such brave warriors because they didn't have any fear for dying, because they would be reborn later on again anyhow. So why bother about dying in a battle? And that's why they were so brave. And then, of course, if Ptolemy associates the lunar nodes already with the situation around the birth, and Caesar describes how Celts were looking at birth or rebirthing, or they were reborn. Then if Hallstatt Celtic princely grave is as just technically already associated with the lunar standstill and with the nodes, then to me it's the conclusion close that it is a statement about his hope of being reborn in a new future. And of course, what is given with him in his princely grave is a warrior wagon and also food and whatever. So he will come back as such a chief with such a wagon.
Oh, yes.
So it's sort of also with Christians or whatever, a sort of hope on a certain event in the future. To describe it very basically. And of course, we all know Christian graves start from the 3rd century onwards, all orientated towards the east. But if we would have found only these graves orientated towards the east and didn't have the Bible, yeah, so we were all certainly saying, as archaeologists,
scared of the north and south.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. But there's something possibly has a cultural meaning. Yeah, that's the only thing we could. But luckily, we have the Bible, which interprets this phenomenon. And with this Celtic Hallstatt period, I think what Caesar describes and Ptolemaios is also a pointer towards the expectations these chiefs of the tribes had in the Hallstatt period.
So your answer to the question is the moon had great significance in the interpretations of the cycles of birth and rebirth, essentially.
Right. Also, the ancient sources already describe it exactly like that. My profession is archaeologist, and I can just lay back and refer to these sources. There's no speculation whatsoever about it. It's just how it is handed over by the sources.
Several of my past interviews, the doctors have talked about the deep history of lunar astronomy, referring to the 28,000 and 30,000-year-old Venus carvings, two of which have what are suspected to be lunar calendars, one holding a horn with 13 marks. Do you agree with the idea that lunar astronomy emerged deep in the Paleolithic as early as 30,000 years ago or earlier?
I think there is no way around this conclusion, but the problem is where to prove it from. There are also from East Germany some bones where they have carved 28 lines in it, vertical lines, which one would say, or 29. I just can't remember. It's very clear that the number is very suspicious, of course, and then you talk a very long time ago. Yeah.
But Allard, while there's a lack of material archaeology, it's not such a big leap of faith to suspect that after centuries or millennia of observing something, that rhyme, story, or geometry could have been used to pass down the primary cycle, surely? Or am I over the woo line into a new age mess?
I see it's more from what I learned from the studies of this Celtic period, that the memorization of these extreme complex processes in the heavens was fully developed in that time. And from that period onwards up to the modern times, the memorization virtually disappeared. And if you then turn your perspective towards the Bronze Age or even further back, I think it is a safe conclusion that memorization was a full memorization. And you talk really about very complex knowledge. Think about these people who were up to the end or beginning of this century still able to memorize poems during a week long, whatever. So these people, in East Turkey, there were still these Calendrical thing, the Gilgamesh thing. They were all memorized things.
Yes.
So from a historical point of view, I think, of course, they were dealing with these cycles. They had awareness of it, but it was all memorized and handed down in memorized ways. Or just from, let's say, from elite class to the next elite class. Well, in the Celtic times, you could probably call them druids. And it's sure that this phenomenon has such old roots back to the beginning of manhood, but with the material which comes down from that period is just so small. But I think the other aspect of the memorization, the capability of memorization, is something we can take for granted.
You know, the Greeks had a system for developing memory called memory loci, whereby they created what was known as a palace of the mind, whereby the student would create a palace. The front doormat might represent the lagoon. The long corridor might represent the plain or the savanna. When he gets through to the balustrades going up, this might represent a mountain. And through memorizing internal spaces that they were familiar with, they could cross vast distances. The Aboriginal Australians used dream time and did the same thing, where coiling serpents would represent mountain ranges and rivers and lagunas. But I think you've hit it on the nail. The missing element from this is not only the 2 winter calendary months, but it's the way to memorize the systems of the moon. And Julius Caesar said the Druids could memorize thousands of poems, and all the way up to 1598 AD, when William Shaw, the King's Masters of Works, wrote the first outlines for the formalization of masonry, how to build cathedrals. He said that masons kept obscure the arts of M, circled, representing memory, suggesting that the cathedral builders had developed systems of memorizing how to derive parallels, how to expand circles and squares. So you have leaned on this hidden element, memory, and I think it's really, really relevant. So I've got to thank you for that, Allard. That's what I'm taking from this interview, the importance of memorization.
Okay. And memorization implies a sort of schematization and also limitations and repeating elements. And that is why I think the moon is the best element around it. When humanity started to structure time and space around itself, it's one of the first things what people start with to apply their capability of memorizing, because it is a sort of drawing board of how to have a repetiting system which can then be memorized. And that's the whole trick, actually. When I play the piano and I learn pieces of Scriabin or whatever by heart, it actually works by the schematic symmetrics within the music pieces.
Fantastic. And what you as well are suggesting, that because as you said, the rulers weren't dying just in time for the lunar maximums and minimums, that there was a class of people who not only had the tools to delineate and build monuments aligned with the moon, but they had the memory of the key angles, the key azimuths in their head, and they were able to apply that in the Magdalenenberg site, for example.
Yep.
A culmination of lunar cycles, monumentalized and ritualized, that essentially served as I suppose would almost have been deemed as a vessel with the chariot in it, by which the ruler could physically be seen to pass to the moon, to go back to from whence they came. Do you think the moon was associated with creation mythology back then, I wonder?
Yeah.
It is in the Andes. She was born just after the sun at the point of creation, and you have the Temple of the Moon in Chia. Well, the burials of the indigenous people in the valley are all to the west, quite clearly on the Moon Mountain, or Waitaka it's known as. The moon is seen setting into the indigenous cemeteries from the Temple of the Moon.
Yeah.
You seen extensions into the landscape?
Luckily, we have also the Glauberg, which is a bit north of Frankfurt. It's about 40 kilometers northeast of Frankfurt. And there they found burial mounds with chiefs or princely graves, even with their statues there in stone. But going with that, there was a huge, what they called a procession lane. That's just how they describe it, Prozessionsstraße. And this lane, more than 300 meters, huge earthworks, were also exactly focused on the southern lunar standstill.
Really?
Wow. And this is my colleague, Professor Dice from Frankfurt. He was there, and he went there, and I think at the last lunar standstill, and luckily there were no clouds, and even luckily that the moon just had risen really at that point. And it's very clear that so not only a massive wooden palisade, but also big groundworks were done to document or materialize the concept of the lunar standstills and the nodes had, in this funerary context of hoping of rebirth of this chief in his next life. So you find it everywhere.
You don't find like one solar solstice axis in the middle of all this, do you? Or is it all lunar?
It's lunar. Like Gunzel already said, the more nature-orientated people are virtually all ticking according to the lunar clock.
Yeah. The farmer's almanac's greatly composed with the moon.
Yeah. It starts with that. And so that the thing really becomes a solar calendar. It starts only 300 BC it starts in Greece when they that they can calculate solar eclipses, so they really can predict them. And the Roman calendar is basically 100% a solar calendar, even if it's at the beginning a bit chaotic still, but and that involves calculation, abstract knowledge and so on, but nothing is hidden anymore like in the Celtic time.
For sure.
That's so it's all you can calculate it in your on your written way, and you have to calculate it written. There's nothing which has been memorized anymore in the Roman times. And I think typically for these earlier Celtic period is that the moon, like nowadays in the Islamic countries, the moon is always something which reigns our life. It determines also harvesting times or whatever, and this is a concept which is in the Islam still there, that your life is being governed by that system, and the solar system frees humanity from this covering the human life with daily life with the rules of the moon. And the solar cycle really frees humanity.
Yes, indeed. Allard, I just want to thank you for coming on and sharing all this wonderful information about the Magdalenenberg site and laying out the lunar astronomy associated with it. So thank you, Allard.
Utmost welcome. Thank you for your time as well.
Super.
Bye.